Hey friends, welcome back to Sewing from Scratch. Today we're going to talk about wovens. Hey guys, welcome back. I am Kate and this is Sewing from Scratch. If you're new here, big welcome. I hope you find this video enjoyable and consider subscribing. So I know a ton of you are either in camp woven or camp knit fabric when it comes to your favorite. And I kind of fluctuate between the two. Right now I am totally into wovens. I don't know, I think I'm going to blame or credit the Love to Sew podcast for this. Caroline and Helen are always talking about their beautiful makes, and a lot of the times they're made from woven fabric. And I mean, Blackbird Fabric carries all these beautiful wovens. A lot of the accounts I follow on Instagram, they're made of these beautiful wovens. And I feel like a lot of the garments I want to make and are conducive to my ideal wardrobe are made from woven fabrics. So if you love woven fabrics as much as I do, please give this video a big thumbs up. Or if you don't like woven fabrics, leave me a comment down below and tell me, why have you not been sewing with wovens? Today I'm going to bring you some tips for working with wovens. So the difference between woven fabrics and knit fabrics is of course the way they are made. So I'm not going to get too much into that. Again, Love to Sew has a great episode on that. I will link it below for you guys if you're interested in learning more about how the fabrics are made. And of course, between the two, there's many different variations of that, and depending on the substrate you're using, etc., you're going to have a very different fabric, as we all know by going into a fabric store or looking online or what have you. So the first discussion we need to have when talking about wovens is about grain line. That is the line that is parallel to the selvage. So when you have a piece of fabric and you roll it out widthwise, you're going to have the selvage ends or the finished ends on either side. Then the part that gets cut at the fabric shop, that is your length. So if you order 1 meter or 5 meters or whatever it is, that is your length. The width of the fabric is determined at processing, and that will never change on your cut of fabric unless you get something like a fat half or a fat quarter. But we're talking about yardage for garment making, so you typically would not order stuff like that. When this becomes important is when we have a directional print especially, but most of the time, just like knits, we're going to be cutting with the grain. We want to lay our patterns out along the length of the fabric, and we want them to be going up and down. Now, I will say that there are certain times where you can cut across the grain and it will be totally fine. Things like pockets or cuffs, anytime that you're not too concerned about the print or the exact properties of the fabric, then you can go ahead and cut on the cross grain, especially if your fabric has the same properties in the cross grain as well as the grain. You don't really need to worry about that as much as with a knit, where one way is way more stretchy than the other way. If you're new to working with wovens, just try to follow the pattern or the tutorial as closely as you can for the optimal results. With grain comes bias. And if you have never heard the term bias, it is simply the diagonal direction of on the fabric. So it is not the cross grain, it is not the grain, it is the bias. So it's at a 45-degree angle to both the cross grain and the grain. And the cool thing about the bias is that it is stretchy. When you hear the term bias tape, it's made from fabric cut on the bias. The bias is its own monster, and there are definitely patterns and things like that that play to the bias and that stretchy factor of it. Like if we want to have a special drape or something like that, there are bias cut garments. I do not recommend that for a beginner. I have never done a bias cut garment. Not something that I'm avoiding. I just don't have the need for it right now. But there are times where you would want to do that. You can also use that sparingly in knit garments. So I have made certain tops with the front panel being woven, and I cut it on the bias to add a little more stretch. I would definitely not be doing this to replace an entire knit garment, but you can use panels and things like that where the garment doesn't need to stretch a lot. So I would not recommend it for sleeves or pants or anything like that if the garment is meant for knits. So now that we've talked about the grain line and you kind of know what to expect and are not afraid of it, we're going to continue on down my list. So the next thing I want to mention about wovens is you can rip it. You may have noticed this at the fabric shop, or you may have noticed this in a YouTube video. You can just make a little snip and then rip your fabric, and it will rip along either the cross grain or the grain. And this is a nice way to keep things nice and even. However, I will caution you not to really do this with a lighter weight fabric or something more delicate. It works really well on quilting cotton or canvas, things that are heavy, more durable, because you can actually stretch the fabric. So it's not something I do often, but when I'm trying to get something really squared up, I will do that, and then I can use my ruler to align with those rips because I know that they are square. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume that we are beginners working with wovens here. So I'm going to recommend that the first fabric you try is quilting cotton, and that's actually what this shirt is made of. And you can see that it has some nice body to it. It has these ruffles I have added, and it has structure. That is what some of the woven fabrics that you're going to encounter will have. So they lend nicely to things like structured pants or boxy tops or dress shirts, anything where you want it to be crisp. You're gonna want to go with a woven fabric. So again, we're going to talk about quilting cotton, which is 100% cotton, and the reason I'm going to start with quilting cotton, even though it is not a traditional garment fabric, is because it's so easy to work with. So don't think that you need to be going out and thinking of wovens as like a rayon challis or a silk or a satin or anything that just seems really hard to work with. That is not what we're talking about when we're talking about wovens. We're talking about the group as a whole, but as a beginner, I recommend something with more structure, like a canvas or a quilting cotton or a cotton lawn, something that is going to be easy to work with. I will put some pattern suggestions down below. This is the bow top from Seamwork magazine. It is modified, but it is very easy, and I will leave the link below for Seamwork. It's like a monthly subscription based website, or you can purchase patterns as you go, and right now their memberships are 50% off, so you can get the ultimate membership for I think the same price as the regular tier 2 membership. So I actually started that April 1st, and I am really loving it, so I do recommend Seamwork. There's like a community and challenges and everything like that, but anyway, I will have that link below for you guys. There are some great beginner patterns there to try with wovens. In terms of needles, what you want to work with is generally an all-purpose needle. If you're working with something stronger like denim or canvas, you might want to use a jean needle, but an all-purpose needle or a universal needle will suit you quite well, especially when you're starting out. Look for something like between that 9 and 12 size and you will do just fine. If you're working with something lighter, like I've shown in other tutorials, you might want to use a microtex needle because that will be a lot finer and not damaged or delicate fabric. So once you have your fabric bought, you've purchased some easy to sew cotton fabric, or linen fabric is another good one to start with. We need to treat that fabric. So what I do in my sewing practice is as soon as fabric comes in my house, it gets washed, whether it's thrifted, whether it's brand new, comes from an online shop, or if I went to the fabric shop and bought it. They all get treated the same. So I bring them in, I wash them in my machine. I like to wash just like I would treat my clothes when they're made. So I wash with one Tide free and clear pod, and I'll throw vinegar in there as well, and I wash on cold, regular cycle, and then I dry on medium. That's just how I wash all my clothes, minus the vinegar. The vinegar I do for fabrics, especially new fabrics, especially when I'm mixing colors, because I don't really sew it that much. You want to wash your fabric, and you will find that obviously 100% cotton fabric, we all know it will shrink. So throw it in that dryer, make sure it shrinks so that when you make something really pretty that you really love, it doesn't shrink in the dryer and then you can't wear it anymore. And when you're washing your fabrics, you might notice that it all frays together and it becomes this big tangled mess. that's just part of the nature of the beast, and don't worry about it too much. If it does concern you, then just wash one piece of yardage at a time, but it's something that's never bothered me. I just, you know, unravel it, cut off the frayed bits, and continue on. Okay, so the next few tips here have to do with actual pattern making and dressmaking and what you want to do when you're working with those patterns. So number one is you want to make sure you transfer all the notches and all the marks onto your patterns. These are more helpful, I find, in woven patterns because the fabric can't be stretched. So it really helps you to line up the notches on, say, a side seam or a leg seam, pant seam, where we're going to be matching up those notches, and then, you know, there might be a notch at the calf and the knee and the hip, and we know that that's where it needs to be, because if you just start at one end and start sewing, you might have to ease in somewhere, and if you don't pin first, you're going to lose that ease, and then you're going to end up with a longer piece at the end. So definitely make sure you use your notches that are set out for you on the pattern piece. And along with that is use pins, and use lots of pins if you have to. I don't use many pins, especially in knit garments. I would rather use wonder clips, but for wovens I do prefer pins. Unless it is a delicate fabric, then I will use clips or glue stick or something to help keep those pieces where I want them. Make your pins your best friend and your journey will go much smoother. I will say though, when you are working with something like a quilting cotton or like a canvas or something, they just like to stay in place. They don't really shift around like something that would be silky or even a knit. They kind of stay where you put them. Still pin, but realize that you're going to be pleasantly surprised with how the fabric reacts to your sewing. Okay, so now you have your seam sewn, and what you want to do next is you have to finish this seam. So unlike knit, where we would probably just use our serger or just a zigzag stitch if you don't have a serger, wovens are different because you need to finish that seam. So typically this means you're going over any seam at least 2 times. So I do not recommend just constructing on a serger because it doesn't have enough seam allowance. So you only have about 1/4 inch there with your serged seam, and a woven fabric can fray. So when you construct, all of your patterns that you use are going to be recommended to use a sewing machine, and they're likely going to have like a 1/2 inch to 5/8 seam allowance, which will be different from a lot of the knit garments that you see where the pattern suggests a 1/4 inch or 3/8 seam allowance because they are assuming that you will use a serger for that. So once you've sewn up your seam on your 1/2 inch or 5/8 seam allowance, you need to now finish that seam. So there's a few different ways you can do this, quite a few different ways. And actually Evelyn Wood just posted a good video on this, so I will link that below. But you can use pinking shears, you can use your serger to actually then go back and just serge the seam edges. You can use things like a French seam or a Hong Kong seam, bice-bound seam. You can do a flat felt seam, or you can just use your regular sewing machine and just do a zigzag stitch along the side or an overcast stitch. There's a few different stitches you can use there as well. But it is important to finish those seams so that they don't fray back into that original construction seam, and then you would get a hole or a tear, and nobody wants that. And the last 2 things I want to mention are just to take your time, and I've really been on this journey of slow sewing, so I'm taking my time to enjoy the process and figure out what I like to do and doing more of that. I'm trying to increase my skill set, always trying to learn every day, and kind of push myself out of my comfort zone to learn these new techniques. And I'm even starting to be interested in couture techniques. So don't be surprised if you see a video coming up with couture techniques in it. But basically just take your time on anything you do, especially working with a new fabric or a new technique or a new pattern. You really want to make sure that you enjoy the experience so that it doesn't leave a bad taste in your mouth and then you don't want to come back to it. On that note, I will say, just have fun and experiment, and there's really no wrong that you can do here. If you're not comfortable making a garment off the hop, just cut out some fabric, sew it together, see how your machine handles it, see how you handle it, and you'll learn a lot about the properties of the fabric that way as well. And once you get more comfortable, you can experiment with things like working on the cross grain for added details in pocket, or making bias tape and doing different seam finishes and adding binding around your neck holes and armholes, and trying different patterns and trying the same pattern with different fabrics. I really do feel that woven fabrics are much more versatile than knits, and I know there's a lot of different knit fabrics out there as well, but for me, wovens are just a whole world where I could spend my entire sewing journey working with wovens, and I still don't think I would experience everything that there is to experience about woven fabrics. Now that's sounding kind of weird. So thanks so much for watching, you guys. I had a lot of fun talking about wovens because they are kind of my new love right now. And I hope that you can experience this too and feel the same way. I look at all these pictures online and think, I want to make that. I want to make that drapey dress. I want to make that big utilitarian chore coat. I want to make that boiler suit, you know. So that's a lot of the reason why I've been working with wovens more in my sewing career. And I feel like in the summertime, a nice linen tank top or a linen dress or a light cotton dress is going to be much more conducive to the temperatures here and my personality, because I do not like the heat. And if I can wear something that keeps me cool, then I'm all for that. I really do hope that you give it a try, especially if you try something like quilting cotton. I'm sure you have an old sheet or something you can work with. I do have quite a few videos where I've used woven fabrics for a plethora of things, so I will link those below for you guys as well. And definitely tag me on Instagram when you make something with woven fabric, because I want to see it. If you're not part of our Facebook group, head down to the description box, join that, and I hope you post in there as well. I want to hear from you guys, so leave me some comments down below. Let's get chatty this week. I'll catch you on Thursday. Bye.